White police officer makes serious accusations against black judge claiming he stole the car he was driving, but when the officer discovers who he is shocked. The sun was beginning to set in Chelsea, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of the city. Daniel Thompson, a respected judge in the community, was driving his car down Central Avenue, lost in thought about his day. He could hardly imagine that just a few blocks away, his life was about to take an unexpected and painful turn. Suddenly, the blue and red lights of a police cruiser pierced the serenity of the evening. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest as he noticed Officer Michael Evans, a white police officer, pulling up behind him. Tension quickly filled the air. Michael exited the vehicle with a serious and determined expression, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "Get out of the car, please," Michael ordered, his voice firm. "Excuse me, officer, but what's going on?" Daniel asked, confused. "I'm Judge Thompson. This car is mine." "I don't believe you're the judge," Michael replied, crossing his arms. "We have a report of a stolen car and you're driving a vehicle that matches the description. Get out of the car now." Daniel felt humiliation wash over him. "Officer, I assure you this car is mine. You can check my identification. I'm a judge and I have nothing to hide." But Michael wasn't listening. The distrust and biases he carried prevented him from seeing beyond Daniel's skin color. He approached the car, pointing at Daniel with an authoritative gesture. "Get out, or I will have to remove you by force." Indignation surged within Daniel. He took a deep breath and decided he wouldn't yield to the pressure. "You're making a mistake. This is an abuse of power." He turned to the passenger window, retrieved his driver's license, and presented it to Michael. "Look, here's my ID, and I can prove that I own this car." Michael hesitated for a moment, but soon called for backup over his radio. "We need assistance here. A man of color is refusing to cooperate and may be armed." Michael's reaction was automatic, rooted in biases he couldn't even recognize. As they waited for backup, the tension escalated. Daniel felt the weight of injustice on his shoulders. He had dedicated his life to fighting for what was right and just, but now, in that moment, he was being treated like a criminal. When backup arrived, the scene turned into a public spectacle. Michael's cruiser surrounded Daniel's car, and more officers approached, ready to act. Daniel found himself surrounded by armed men, each looking at him with suspicion. His heart raced as humiliation and anger mixed within him. "Cuff him!" shouted one of the officers while Michael pointed at Daniel as if he were the most dangerous criminal in the city. "No, wait!" Daniel protested, his voice almost breaking. "I'm a judge. You're making a mistake." The officers, however, were unwilling to listen. With a swift motion, they cuffed Daniel and pulled him out of the car. He felt exposed and vulnerable as the crowd that had gathered watched the scene, some with looks of sympathy, others with nervous laughter, as if the spectacle was entertainment. "This is unacceptable," Daniel shouted, his voice echoing down the street. "You have no idea what you're doing." Michael, standing nearby, looked at Daniel but didn't see the man before him. He saw only the skin color and the figure that challenged his authority. "The law is the law, sir," he replied, emotionless. "You'll have your chance to explain at the station." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to stay calm, but the humiliation was unbearable. He had never imagined that, in an instant, everything he had built could crumble before his eyes, and above all, the fragility of his position in society was becoming as clear as day. Before we continue with this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. And let us know in the comments which city you're watching this video from. Emma Thompson took a deep breath as she ran through the streets of Chelsea, her heart racing. The call she received from Daniel was brief, but the tension in his voice left her on high alert. "He's being cuffed," she thought as her mind raced. How could this be happening? Daniel, a respected judge, could never be treated like a criminal. When she arrived at the scene, the sight before her was surreal and devastating. She spotted her husband, surrounded by 3 police officers, one of them being Officer Michael Evans, who had initiated the whole mess. Daniel stood there, hands behind his back, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. Emma felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. "Daniel!" she shouted, rushing toward him. "Emma, no!" Daniel tried to warn her, but the intensity of the situation compelled her to ignore his plea. She stopped in front of him, staring down the officers with fierce determination. "What is happening here? Why are you doing this to him?" Her voice trembled with indignation. Michael, still maintaining a serious expression, replied, "We received information that this car is stolen. We need to process this." He didn't seem convinced. but his rigid posture showed a troubling determination. "You can't be serious. This is my husband's car. He's a judge," Emma exclaimed, frustration spilling over. Hearing this, Daniel let out a low groan, the pressure of humiliation becoming almost unbearable. "Calm down, Emma. This will pass," Daniel said, trying to comfort her. But Emma could see he was struggling against the pain of being treated like a criminal. She knew the situation was deeper than just a simple mistake. Institutional racism was not just a theory. It was right there, alive and cruel before her eyes. As the officers moved away, taking Daniel to the cruiser, Emma felt overwhelmed with helplessness. What more could she do? At home, she watched her husband enter, still cuffed, and the scene crushed her. "How can you go through this, Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her with sadness. "I don't know, Emma. This is surreal. I never thought this would happen to me." Daniel sat down on the sofa, shock still etched on his face. "I think I always knew this was a possibility, but I never thought it would be me." Emma moved closer, sitting beside him and holding his hand. "We'll find a way through this. You can't let this slide. We need to fight." She looked into his eyes, searching for the determination she had always admired. "The community needs to know what happened. And what if this ruins my career?" Daniel replied, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Daniel replied, concern evident in his voice. "I can't afford to lose everything I've built. But what if you don't fight? What if no one hears your story?" Emma retorted, her passion burning. "We need to show that this isn't just about you, it's about everyone facing the same kind of injustice. You're a judge, Daniel. Your voice has power." He hesitated, feeling the weight of responsibility. "What if people don't believe me? What if I'm discredited? Then we'll prove the truth, we'll unite, mobilize the community. I'll call in activists, Daniel. We need to make some noise," Emma said, her determination growing. That night, Emma decided to take action. She organized a meeting with activist friends and began sketching out a plan. As they arrived, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. "Everyone, what happened to Daniel is unacceptable. We need to do something about it," she declared, looking each of them in the eye. But not everyone was so confident. "Emma, you know this could jeopardize his career, right?" one friend interjected, concern lacing his voice. "It's a huge risk." "And what's riskier, staying silent or fighting against injustice?" Emma questioned, her gaze steady and determined. "I can't just sit back while my husband is treated like a criminal. We need to come together and make sure people hear us." The debate intensified, with differing opinions among those present. Some were worried about repercussions while others were equally outraged and ready to act. Emma felt the tension, but she was determined not to let fear take over. Deep down, she knew Daniel's struggle could be the beginning of something much larger, a fight for justice that could resonate beyond their lives. Michael sat in his small office, the walls adorned with photos of his children and wife, as if seeking comfort in famine. The words he heard on the day of the incident haunted him, and he couldn't shake the image of Daniel Thompson being handcuffed, a respected judge treated like a criminal. He picked up his journal, a gift from his wife to help him process his feelings. The pages were a safe space, a place where he could leave his most sincere reflections. "How could I have done this?" he murmured to himself, as the pen danced across the page. "I'm not like this. I'm not a racist. What happened to me?" His hands trembled as he wrote. The pen felt heavy, as if each word carried an emotional weight he wasn't ready to bear. He remembered how quick he had been to jump to conclusions, fueled by prejudices he thought he had overcome. "I didn't listen to Daniel. I didn't see him as an equal. I only saw the color of his skin." Hours went by, but Michael's internal struggle didn't wane. The image of Daniel being treated with disdain and dehumanization haunted him, reflecting a truth he refused to confront. That night, he decided he needed answers. With an almost desperate impulse, he accepted an invitation from a childhood friend, Lucas, who was now a community activist. They hadn't seen each other in years, but Michael remembered how Lucas had always been a vocal advocate for social issues. As he entered the cafe where they met, he noticed Lucas's expression, a mix of curiosity and concern. "Michael, good to see you," Lucas said with a nervous smile. "You seem different." "I feel different," Michael replied, pulling out a chair. "What happened to Daniel shook me to my core. I don't know what to do. I need to understand." Lucas leaned forward, seriousness taking over his face. "What you did to Daniel was a reflection of who you are, Michael. You need to face that head on. Racism isn't just about individual actions, it's a system with deep roots. You've always had the chance to see this, but you ignored it. I'm not a racist, Michael snapped, his voice rising. I strive not to be. I've always tried to treat people with respect. And yet you didn't listen to Daniel. Lucas interrupted, his gaze piercing. You saw him as a suspect before you saw him as a human being. That is racism, and you need to acknowledge that if you truly want to change. Lucas's words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He felt vulnerable, exposed. How can I make amends? What do I do now? He asked, sincerity in his voice. Lucas took a deep breath. Start by educating yourself. Attend community meetings. Listen to voices that aren't being heard. You need to put yourself in situations that challenge your worldview. You can make a difference, but it starts within you. In the days that followed, Michael began attending meetings on racism and social justice, a challenge that brought discomfort with every step. As he entered a room full of unfamiliar faces for the first time, he felt a knot in his throat. What am I doing here, he thought, but at the same time there was a spark of determination. During one of these meetings, a young man named Carlos stood up to share his story. I've been stopped by police just for being on the street. They didn't care who I was. The color of my skin was all they saw. Carlos spoke with such passion that the room fell silent, absorbing his words. Michael felt his heart clench. He realized that the experiences of people like Carlos were real and painful. After the meeting, he approached the young man. I want to understand more. I was part of the problem, and I want to be part of the solution. Carlos looked at him, surprised. You're not like the other cops I've known. Do you really want to change? Yes, Michael replied, his voice steady. I can't change the past, but I want to do better moving forward. Michael's journey of self-discovery was just beginning, but for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. He didn't know what the future held, but he was determined to confront his biases and fight for a more just world. And as he wrote in his journal, hope began to bloom amidst the pain of reflection. The story of the incident involving Daniel Thompson quickly spread throughout the city, garnering unexpected media attention. At the police station, Graham Edwards, Michael Evans's superior, sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and reports. The phone wouldn't stop ringing, and the pressure was palpable. He knew he needed to act, but the situation was unfolding in ways he hadn't anticipated. Graham, you need to see this, exclaimed one of the officers, bursting in without knocking. He threw a newspaper on the table. The headline in bold letters read, Black judge accused of theft by white police officer. What's happening in Chelsea? Graham massaged his temple, feeling a headache starting to form. This isn't good. We need to control the narrative before it spreads any further. The press is all over this, and protesters are beginning to gather in front of the precinct. They're demanding justice, and the situation could spiral out of control. The officer continued, his expression worried. Graham took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He knew the city was at a boiling point and that the police force was being scrutinized more intensely than he could have imagined. We need a statement, something to minimize the damage. What do you suggest? Maybe a press conference, the officer suggested hesitantly. But what if reporters ask about Michael's involvement? That could complicate things even more. We need to be transparent, but we can't let him become the focus, Graham replied, his nerves starting to show in his voice. He knew that Michael, although well-intentioned, had made a grave mistake, and this could cost much more than a simple reprimand. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, a growing group of protesters began to gather. Among them, Emma was at the forefront, holding a sign that read, Justice for Daniel, her voice echoing amid the shouts of support. She felt a mix of anger and determination, knowing she needed to fight not just for her husband, but for everyone who had suffered unjustly. This won't stand, Emma shouted to the crowd, which responded with applause and cheers of encouragement. We have to show that we won't accept this humiliation. One of the protest organizers approached her. Emma, have you seen what the media is saying? We need a strong statement from you that can mobilize even more people. I will speak, Emma replied, her gaze firm. We need the city to know that injustice will not be tolerated. Back at the precinct, Graham was in a tense meeting with other officers. The atmosphere was heavy, and the divide between those who wanted a more aggressive approach and those calling for caution was becoming increasingly clear. We can't let this affect our image, shouted an older officer, slamming his hand on the table. We need to show strength. And what strength is that? Retorted another, visibly irritated. We're talking about an innocent man here. We need justice, not more violence. Graham tried to intervene. We need to find a middle ground. The situation is already critical, and any misstep could result in disaster. We need a cohesive plan. And what if the press starts asking tough questions? What will we say? Asked an officer, a worried look on her face. We'll have to be clear and transparent. We can't let the image of the police become the villain of this story. We need to stand with the truth, Graham said, his voice firm, but tinged with uncertainty. As the discussion continued, the media pressure didn't wane. Reporters began to cluster at the entrance of the precinct, eager for a statement that could clarify the incident. Graham felt the urgency rising. He needed to act before the situation slipped out of his hands. Let's hold the press conference, he finally decided, looking at his colleagues. But we need to prepare our responses, and let it be clear, we will treat this matter with the seriousness it deserves. The community deserves to know that we are here to serve and protect, not to perpetuate injustices. The atmosphere was charged with tension as everyone agreed, aware that the coming hours could define not only Daniel's future, but also the community's trust in the police. The voices outside grew louder, and Emma's determination became a symbol of resistance as the pressure on Graham and his team intensified. The auditorium was packed, and the atmosphere was electric with expectation. Daniel Thompson, a respected judge known for his firm stance against injustices, was about to participate in a panel on racism and justice. Beside him, Emma, his wife, watched intently, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. She knew this would be a decisive moment not just for Daniel, but for everyone facing discrimination daily. "Are you ready for this?" Emma asked, holding his hand tightly. Daniel looked into her eyes, seeking comfort. He had always been a man of words, but at that moment insecurity overwhelmed him. "I am... but what if they don't listen to me? What if they only see me as a black judge and not as a human being?" His voice trembled slightly, doubt echoing in his heart. "You need to speak the truth, Daniel. Your experience is valid and important. Don't let fear stop you from sharing your story." Emma spoke with conviction, her determination shining through her words. Daniel nodded, but anxiety still consumed him. During the preparation meetings leading up to the event, Daniel felt surrounded by colleagues who, instead of supporting his fight, minimized his experiences. "Oh, you know how it is, Daniel. This is just a matter of perspective. We need to understand their side too," said one of his middle-aged colleagues who always tried to soften racial issues. Frustration flooded Daniel as he couldn't understand how some could be so insensitive. "This isn't a matter of perspective, this is a matter of life and death. Do you understand that?" Daniel replied, his voice raised, drawing the attention of others in the room. The silence that followed was palpable, expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort. "Calm down, Daniel. We'll find a middle ground here," insisted another colleague, trying to diffuse the situation. But Daniel was exhausted from trying to find common ground with those who couldn't see the gravity of what was at stake. On the night of the panel, the auditorium was filled with people from various backgrounds, all united by curiosity and the desire to hear the truth. Daniel was nervous, his heart racing as he walked onto the stage. He looked out at the audience and saw Emma waving encouragingly, a symbol of the love and support that always accompanied him. "Good evening, everyone," Daniel began, his voice trembling slightly. "Tonight I'm here to share not only my experience as a judge but as a black man living in a society still wrestling with institutional racism." His words began to flow. He recounted the day he was stopped by a police officer who accused him of stealing the car he was driving, a moment that laid bare the cruel reality many, like him, faced daily. "I am not just a judge. I am a father, a husband, and I am also a man who is afraid of being judged, afraid of being treated like a criminal, afraid that my life doesn't matter." As he spoke, the audience seemed hypnotized. Michael, who was among those present, felt each phrase like a dagger to his conscience. He remembered the moment he stopped Daniel, the way he had treated him, and shame began to seep into his heart. Daniel continued, "The injustice I faced is not an isolated incident. It's a reality that many of us live. We urgently need to address these issues not just with words, but with concrete actions." He felt the energy in the room shift, a wave of understanding beginning to emerge among the listeners. By the end of his speech, he felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Applauded to his feet, Daniel took a deep breath, but his mind was still swirling with doubts about the real impact his words would have. Emma stood up, tears in her eyes, and applauded fervently, reflecting the hope that still pulsed in her heart. Daniel was nervous. The auditorium was packed, the chairs arranged in rows of dark wood, reflecting the soft light coming from hanging chandeliers. The murmuring voices of the audience quieted as he stepped onto the stage, a microphone in front of him, and the expectant gaze of many who knew and respected him. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes fixed on him, as if each one carried an expectation, a desire to hear not just what he had to say, but how he truly felt. Taking a deep breath, Daniel looked at the audience. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice slightly trembling but firm. "I am here today to share something that has deeply affected me, something that is not just about me, but about all of us." He paused, allowing his words to settle. He recalled the day he was stopped by Michael, the confusion, the humiliation. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, remembering the feeling of helplessness that washed over him. "Recently, I went through an experience that made me question not only my position as a judge, but what it means to be a black man in our society." The audience was attentive, and Daniel could feel the tension in the air. He remembered the pain in his heart, the look of disappointment on Emma's face when he came home, handcuffed and desolate. "I am a judge. I have dedicated my life to seeking justice and equity. But in that moment I was treated like a criminal. A car that I owned, a car that was mine, became a symbol of a prejudice I had known but had never experienced so directly." He looked at the faces in the audience, seeking connection, and saw faces reflecting empathy and understanding. Institutional racism is not just a theoretical concept. It seeps into our daily lives, into the simplest interactions, and often, we who hold positions of power think we are immune to it, but we are not. In the audience, Michael listened intently to every word. He felt a knot in his throat as Daniel spoke. The weight of responsibility and guilt began to accumulate in his chest. "It takes courage to recognize our own mistakes and prejudices," he thought, as the sincerity in Daniel's voice resonated within him. He remembered his own journey, the internal struggle he faced after the incident. "I know many of you might feel uncomfortable right now," Daniel continued, "but it's exactly this discomfort that we need to face. We must look within ourselves and question our beliefs, our actions, and more importantly, the system that perpetuates injustice. We need to unite to promote change." Applause began softly, but soon intensified, echoing in the auditorium. Daniel felt warmth in his heart, a sense of call. He looked at Emma in the audience, who smiled encouragingly, giving him strength. "We cannot remain silent in the face of injustice. Silence only perpetuates what already exists. If you are a witness, you have an obligation to speak. If you are an agent of change, you must act." Daniel's words were like a call to action. He saw familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and some strangers, who were there, all united by a greater cause. "This is not just about me. It's about all of us. It's about our communities, our children, and the future we want to build together. A future where everyone can live without fear, where justice is not just a word, but a reality accessible to all." As his speech neared its end, Daniel felt tears in his eyes. "I am here to affirm that change is possible. Together we can fight against racism, discrimination, and injustice. Let's work not just as individuals, but as a community. Let's be the voice that echoes and transforms. The struggle is long, but we must not give up." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. The auditorium fell silent. The intensity of the message had left everyone deep in thought, and the atmosphere was thick with emotion. He looked once more at the audience and saw Michael, who appeared moved, absorbing every word, every feeling. When Daniel finished his speech, applause erupted in a wave of support. He felt the strength of the audience, the recognition of his struggle, and the solidarity now permeating the atmosphere. But in his heart, he knew the fight was just beginning. After the panel, the mood in the room was charged with emotions. Daniel, still breathless from nerves, looked at the audience that was now applauding him. The sound of applause echoed, but his mind was racing, processing what he had just shared. The words he had spoken about his experience with racism and the pain of being treated like a criminal, despite being a respected judge, resonated deeply within him. Meanwhile, Michael was in the audience, consumed by a mix of feelings. Daniel's speech had been a gut punch, a raw truth he could no longer ignore. He slowly stood up, feeling the gaze of everyone on him, and then found the courage to speak. "Excuse me, I need to say something," he began, his voice hesitant but determined. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Daniel, surprised, furrowed his brow in confusion. Michael continued, "I am the officer who stopped Daniel, and I was wrong. I let my prejudices guide me and I didn't listen. I didn't see the person in front of me. He took a deep breath, trying to control the wave of emotions that washed over him. I am not just a police officer. I am a human being who needs to learn from his mistakes. The audience murmured, some appearing surprised, others visibly skeptical. Daniel, for his part, felt a mix of relief and distrust. He didn't know if he could trust Michael's words. "Why are you doing this now?" Daniel asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Do you really believe what you're saying?" I'm trying," Michael replied, his tone sincere. "After what happened, I started reflecting on everything. What I did wasn't just wrong, it was unacceptable. And I can't just sit here and do nothing. What I want is to understand. I want to learn how I can help change this." "And how do you plan to do that?" Daniel questioned, still defensive. "You can't just apologize and expect everything to be resolved. This is a much bigger issue." "I know," Michael agreed, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I want to work with you, with the community. I want to understand what I can do to help combat institutional racism in the police force. I want you and others to know that there are police officers who care and are willing to fight for justice." The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel looked at Michael, weighing his intentions. He wanted to believe that Michael's words were genuine, but the pain he had felt was still too fresh. "Do you really think you can change anything? That you can make a difference?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Yes," Michael replied firmly. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to try. I can't undo what I did, but I can work to ensure it doesn't happen again. If you give me the chance, I would like to meet with you to discuss how we can start this change." Daniel hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision. He wanted to believe there was hope for change, not just in Michael, but in the system as a whole. "All right," he finally said, "but this won't be easy. There will be resistance. Are you prepared to face that?" "I am," Michael asserted, determination clear in his voice. "I know I can't expect everyone to accept this right away, but I'm ready to fight for it." The conversation that followed was a moment of vulnerability and openness. Daniel and Michael began discussing ideas on how they could work together to address the issue of racism and promote inclusion within the police force. Although there was a long road ahead, that meeting marked the beginning of a dialogue that could eventually lead to significant change. Meanwhile, Daniel still had his doubts, but he felt that perhaps there was an opportunity for transformation, not just for him, but for many others facing the same struggle. And so, amidst a tumult of emotions, a new possibility began to emerge, bringing a glimmer of hope to a previously bleak scenario. Emma watched the interaction between Daniel and Michael with a cautious gaze, her feelings swirling in a sea of conflicting emotions. There was a spark of hope in her mind, but also a shadow of distrust that lingered. Since the incident, she had become a fierce advocate for justice, and the idea that Michael, the man who had almost destroyed her husband's life, could become an ally, unsettled her. "Do you think he really cares about change?" Emma asked Daniel, who was lost in thought watching the scene unfold before him. Michael was animatedly gesturing, explaining his ideas for a more inclusive future. "I don't know, Emma," Daniel replied, his voice low yet firm. "Maybe he's convincing himself that it's time to change, but I still don't know if I can trust him." Emma frowned, her eyes narrowing as she observed Michael. He seemed genuine, but the doubt persisted. He played such a significant role in all of this. How can we be sure this isn't just a PR move to clean up his image? "I understand your concerns," Daniel said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But things don't change if we don't start talking. If he really is willing to listen and learn, who am I to reject that opportunity?" Their conversation was interrupted when Michael approached, a nervous smile on his face. "Hi, Daniel." "Emma." He took a deep breath, as if preparing for a speech. "I know this may seem strange, but I really want to work with you. I've realized I need to do more than just feel remorse. I want to act." Emma crossed her arms, still skeptical. "And why should we believe you? What you did was unacceptable." "I know," Michael replied, lowering his head, "and I'm not here to justify or minimize what I did. What I did was horrible, and I can't change that. But I've learned, and I'm trying to understand how I can be part of the solution." Seeing Michael's vulnerability, Daniel decided to intervene. "And how do you envision that happening? What do you have in mind?" "I want to help create a sensitivity program within the police," Michael said quickly, his passion growing. "A space where officers can hear stories from people who have suffered injustices. A place where we can discuss racism and prejudice without fear of retaliation." Emma was still hesitant. but the idea began to resonate with her. And how will you ensure this isn't just another empty initiative? How can we be sure we're not just throwing words around? I want you to be involved, Michael proposed, looking Daniel in the eyes. I want your voice and the voices of the community to be part of this. If there's no representation, if there's no truth, it won't be authentic. Daniel and Emma exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath. This could be a start, but we need a real commitment. We don't want just words, but concrete actions. Michael nodded quickly. I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. I want to change, and if that means working alongside you, I'm ready for it. Emma, still cautious, decided to give the proposal a chance. If we're going to do this, we need total transparency. We won't allow fear or politics to hinder our goal. I promise it will be different, Michael replied, sincerity shining through. Let's create something that really makes a difference. Let's work together. With a newfound sense of purpose, the three began discussing the details of the initiative. The idea of joining forces, even born from such a tense context, seemed to be transforming into an opportunity for change. Emma, though still wary, felt a spark of hope. If their alliance could flourish, who knew how many other lives could be touched and transformed as well? Graham Edwards sat at his desk, surrounded by papers and reports that seemed to pile up like a storm about to break. The pressure from the media and the growing public outrage weighed on his shoulders like an anchor. He looked out the window of his office at the police station, observing the protesters outside, waving signs demanding justice for Daniel Thompson. The scene was a constant reminder that his position as police chief was becoming increasingly unsustainable. I can't keep going like this, he murmured to himself, rubbing his temples. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was one of his aides, reminding him of the meeting scheduled with senior officers. Graham sighed, knowing that resistance to change would come in full force. In the conference room, a group of officers awaited him, and the atmosphere was tense. They were divided between those who wanted to continue with traditional policing practices and those who recognized the need for reform. Graham sat at the head of the table and looked at the faces staring back at him, some filled with distrust, others merely skeptical. Good morning, everyone, he began, trying to adopt a tone of authority. Today we need to discuss what is happening in our city and how it affects us as a police force. One of the officers, Lieutenant Johnson, interrupted. Chief, the protesters don't know what they're talking about. What happened to Judge Thompson was a mistake, but we can't let a minority dictate how we operate. Graham felt his blood boil. And what do you suggest? We ignore what's happening and continue as if nothing has changed? The world is changing, Johnson. People are tired of injustices. But we need to maintain order. If we start bending to their demands, we'll lose respect. Johnson replied, crossing his arms defensively. Respect? Do you think the public respects us now? After what happened to Daniel? We need to be the change, Graham said, his voice rising slightly. He could feel the heat of the debate intensifying in the room. A younger officer, Detective Silva, raised her hand timidly. Chief, maybe we can listen to the community's concerns and find a way to work together. If Daniel and Michael are willing to engage, perhaps we should seize this opportunity. That's a weak idea, Silva, Johnson shot back. If we go after them, it'll look like we're surrendering. We need to show strength, not weakness. Graham intervened, raising his hand. Silva is right. We need a new path, and that starts with an open conversation with Daniel and Michael. I want to discuss their ideas and how we can integrate fairer and more transparent practices into our protocol. Johnson narrowed his eyes. This is a mistake, Chief. You can't just ally with them. They don't understand what it's like to be on the other side. Maybe you should try, Graham replied challengingly. We're dealing with issues that go beyond us. If we can't change public perception, we risk losing our credibility and effectiveness as a police force. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, and Graham realized he was at a crossroads. He looked at the officers, each firmly holding on to their beliefs, but he knew that resistance to change could be as destructive as inertia. I'm not asking you to agree with everything Daniel and Michael say. What I'm asking is that you consider the possibility that we need to evolve if we want to be the police our community deserves. Silence. Graham took a deep breath and continued. If we want to be part of the solution, we need to adapt. I will meet with Daniel and Michael to discuss this. If you oppose this, I'll consider it a lack of trust in my leadership. The expressions in the room shifted, and he could feel the tension dissipating a bit. One of the officers, Sergeant Lee, finally spoke up. Chief, if you believe this is what we need to do, then I'm on board. But it won't be easy. I know it won't be easy, Lee, but significant changes rarely are, Graham replied, feeling a renewed sense of determination. We need to act now, before it's too late. The press conference was packed. Cameras flashed, microphones were raised, and journalists squeezed in, seeking a statement that could change the course of the story. Daniel, now more confident after his participation in the panel, sat alongside Michael, who seemed nervous but determined. Graham, the police chief, stood at the front, his expression troubled, aware of the storm approaching. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, Graham began, his voice firm yet trembling with discomfort. We are here to clarify the events surrounding the accusation against Judge Daniel Thompson. The pressure in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that the truth revealed here could shake the foundations of the Chelsea police force. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words he was about to speak. He turned to Daniel, who nodded, encouraging him. I would like to start by saying that I acknowledge my mistake, Michael said, his voice resonating in the room. What happened to Daniel was a tragedy. I let ingrained prejudices influence my judgment, but what I discovered afterward forced me to reevaluate not just the incident, but the entire system to which I belong. Murmurs began to spread through the room. Graham's expression darkened, but Michael pressed on. I have evidence that proves the accusation against Daniel was not just a mistake. There was a larger scheme at play, a corruption ring that infiltrated our own police force. How so? A reporter interrupted, her voice laced with disbelief. What kind of corruption? Michael, now more comfortable in his position, began to lay out the details. The car Daniel was driving was not a stolen vehicle. It belonged to a police informant. I was led to believe it was a standard situation, and I made a mistake by not verifying the facts. The truth is that there was a cover-up involving some of our own officers. Graham, visibly affected, tried to intervene, but Michael continued. I apologize to Daniel, his family, and everyone impacted by this injustice. This is not just a personal issue. It's an institutional problem. We need change. We need accountability. Daniel, who had been silent until now, felt emotions boiling inside him. He stood up, facing the room. I thank Michael for having the courage to speak the truth. The fight against institutional racism is a battle we all must face. This is not just a matter of justice for me, but an issue that affects our entire community. How can we expect justice if those tasked with upholding it are not held accountable for their actions? Daniel's words reverberated in the room, and the audience fell silent. A reporter raised her hand again. What does this mean for the Chelsea police force? Will there be firings, real reform? We are undergoing a complete reassessment of our protocols and practices, Graham replied, a newfound determination in his voice. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to happen again. We are committed to working with the community and ensuring that justice is served, not just in words, but in actions. The press conference ended, but the impact of the revelations was just beginning. Daniel and Michael left together, surrounded by journalists. Emma, who had been watching from the back with a proud smile, approached them. You did it, Daniel. The truth is finally being heard. And the fight doesn't end here, Daniel replied, a spark in his eyes. We need more people willing to stand up and speak out. We cannot be afraid to confront injustice. Michael, listening to Daniel's words, felt a wave of hope. I want to commit to working with you to be part of this change. I can't undo the past, but I can help shape a better future. Let's do this together, Emma said, extending her hand to Michael. The gesture was symbolic, an unexpected alliance between them. Daniel looked at the outstretched hand, feeling that perhaps the transformation he so desperately desired was finally beginning to happen. As the three of them walked away from the press conference, the sun began to set, casting a soft light on their faces. It was a new beginning, a moment of hope amid a sea of injustice, and they were ready to fight for a fairer future. We have reached the end of this moving story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Right now, there's a playlist of videos on your screen, and if you want to keep watching these touching stories, just click on it to start. And now, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and leave a like to support our work. Now, a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to know your opinion. Until the next video,